It's a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Ryan Williams. As you've heard, he has 2 degrees already from University of Calgary, and then he went to Cambridge, England, to get his PhD from the Faculty of Divinity there, which he completed in 2012. He now is back in Calgary as a postdoc fellow, and which is an achievement in itself. It's probably harder to get a postdoc than get into a PhD program. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but Ryan has a postdoc fellowship at U of C in the Department of Religious Studies, and he has continued to be a member of a research center at the University of Cambridge, so he is a busy man. Ryan is a member of the Canadian Network for Research on Terrorism, Security, and Society. He's working on a project now on trust, prisoner leadership, and risk in maximum security prisons. So Ryan maybe will say a bit about how he got into this field of research, which is a fascinating one, but maybe not for the faint of heart, not for everybody. He also has an interest in understanding the Islamic revival in prisons, understanding risks since 9/11, and assessing risk assessment in relation to extremism and radicalization. So Ryan's field is really where the rubber meets the road. It's one thing to theorize, but Ryan is really looking at some issues that I think we're all, that affect where we live. Ryan has published in the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, the Journal of Contemporary Religion, and Critical Studies on Terrorism. So Ryan's lecture this evening is Redeeming the Unredeemable. Tomorrow he is lecturing at noon hour in the Social Sciences Building, room 113. So this evening's lecture will go for about an hour, and then we'll have about 15 minutes of questions from you. We'll have a roving mic here, and so that's the way it will play out. So let's welcome Ryan Williams.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you all for coming this evening. I'm very pleased to see many other bodies here because you can help me think through these hugely complex issues. As you'll have noticed from the abstract, it's a difficult topic, so I'm glad to have you here with me. And I'm always surprised to see how much interest the topic of terrorism generates. And it reminds me of a quip by Martha Crenshaw, who's a terrorist expert, who commented in the 1990s, the early 1990s, that there are more terrorist experts in the world than there are terrorists. And I think that her comment reigns true today. Now, just to be clear, I'm a sociologist of religion. I'm not a terrorist expert. But as such, that means that I am interested in what terrorism tells us about our world, about society, and about the contemporary human condition. So I'm interested in all of those issues, and terrorism happens to intersect on all of those. And today I want to explore the very idea of rehabilitating the extremist offender, and why this seems like such an impossible idea. I'm interested in the social and political attitudes that inform resistance against this possibility, and I want to open up the possibility that convicted terrorist offenders can be rehabilitated. The work that I present here is the beginning of a project rather than its end, but don't be disappointed, because it follows from over 7 years of researching issues around contemporary religion and security. And it also follows from conversations with incarcerated terrorist offenders, which was a small and even unanticipated part of an 18-month study of 2 maximum security prisons in England. And I'm very grateful to Professor Alison Liebling at Cambridge and my colleagues Ruth Armstrong and Richard Bramwell, who continue to nourish my thinking on this topic, and I travel there frequently and meet up with them, and we have great in-depth conversations. And I'm very grateful to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and the Department of Religion and Classics here at the University of Calgary, who are currently hosting me as I think through these issues. So thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and opportunity and challenge, definitely. Now, my interest in this topic arises from a profound dissatisfaction with my own ability and the ability of others to recognize the full complexity of the issues around religious extremism. Now, certainly, the question of rehabilitating convicted terrorists is a new one and a very narrow one. It's certainly not something that you think about on your way to work in the morning. But it is a question that touches on profound social and political issues today, including questions about belonging, about exclusion, and about responsibility. Now I'm using Omar Khadr's story as a hook into the topic, though we know that his case is unique and exceptional. As a child soldier, as a Guantanamo Bay detainee, as someone who suffered at the hands of others, his story truly is exceptional. His own personal story, I think, is indelibly inscribed into the Canadian imagination. We have followed his journey for well over a decade in the press, and to be sure, he has evoked ambivalent attitudes. His case has exposed governmental infighting and seedy international politics, and most recently, his release has marked a point of indecision among the Canadian public. Now, this indecision is very important for my talk today. Consider two sets of recent polling data. When a polling company inquired into the levels of support in February of this year for the increased counterterrorism measures through legislation of Bill C-51, a strong majority supported that bill. More than 4 in 5 did, in fact, and in fact, among those who did support it, they wanted more. 36% of them said that the legislation didn't go far enough. Now, if we were to take these attitudes and read into them a little bit more, we would expect that the public would have highly risk-averse and even punitive attitudes. Yet, when the same polling company asked about Omar Khadr, there was a striking uncertainty. One-third of Canadians disagreed with the judicial decision to release Khadr on bail. The same amount disagreed. So the same amount agreed, same amount disagreed with this decision, and 1/4 were unsure. I think this indecision marks what Irving Goffman, who is a sociologist, called a rupture in our expectation. His classic work on stigma suggests how easy it is to mark someone else's social identity, in this case as a terrorist, without us even being aware of how we are imposing labels on others. The term stigma, as you may know, arose from the Greeks who used bodily signs that were cut or burnt into the flesh to advertise the slave, the criminal, or the traitor as having inferior moral status, and as someone who is to be avoided, especially in public. Now, we only become aware of the labels that we are imposing on others, Goffman argues in the contemporary context, when something challenges our expectation, when there is a rupture. Omar Khadr is not what we expected. He says, "I don't wish people to love me. I don't wish people to hate me. I just wish for people to give me a chance." And he continues, "I want to devote a few months every year that I lost to experience these things so I can actually grow." And he again says, "Things happen for a reason, and sometimes you have to fall to be able to appreciate standing up." Now this sounds very much like a human being. This sounds very much like someone who I could get along very well with. And I want to capitalize on this moment of Canadian indecision because it marks an opportunity to reflect on both the labels that we impose on others and an opportunity to consider the possibility of redemption for a new category of offender, those convicted for terrorist-related offenses. So in this talk this evening, I will begin by showing that Western nations are convicting more and more people for terrorism-related offenses, and I will describe some of the reasons behind this. Then I will pose 3 reasons why I see there is resistance against the possibility of redeeming the convicted terrorist. The first, these are very straightforward, the first is that the issue is framed in terms of war. The second is that religion is viewed as especially dangerous. And the third is that we don't have any success stories of people who have been convicted and who have gone on to live successful lives. And so my aim at very least this evening is to convince you that this question is worth asking. But let me start with one story to illustrate exactly what we're up against. Earlier this month, news broke of a trial where a teen was charged for terrorist-related offenses. The boy had pleaded guilty for robbing a convenience store and is currently on trial in Quebec Court's Youth Division on one charge of committing crime, and this is the crime, for the benefit of, at the discretion of, or in association with a terrorist group, and a second charge of attempting to leave Canada for the purpose of aiding a terrorist group. So this boy was 15 at the time, but he's 16 now. And the story, of course, as you can imagine, continues, and it suggests that the boy held views that were against the state, and this opposition was framed in Islamic language. And these stories, I think, are very familiar in North America and Europe. So this is just a random example, but you will hear these stories in every European country and in North America as well. And I think that they can be read as signs of the times, or they can be read as an oracle into the future. As an oracle into the future, we need to begin to ask, what about the eventual release of these individuals? Criminologists woke up to this reality at the turn of the new millennium in view of the massive rates of people being imprisoned, particularly in the United States. As the rates of people entering prison was drastically on the rise, Jeremy Travis, apparently famous in criminology circles, warned that they all come back. So as more people are being imprisoned for terrorist-related offenses, we must also recognize that they all come back. And I think this situation raises questions around the redeemability of the convicted terrorist offender. The imminent release of offenders convicted of terrorism follows from a number of trends, including the changing nature of terrorism acts, Syria being one of these, a rise in the numbers of individuals convicted of terrorism with short-term sentences, and the possibility of release for those serving longer-term sentences. In 2010, there were 123 individuals in UK prisons for terrorist-related offenses, and roughly 80% of those were for Al-Qaeda-related terrorism. And today, one very recent publicly available figure, and you might notice the references from the London Evening Standard. So when I say publicly available figure, I mean it was on the train next to me as I was writing this, and I picked it up. And it says that a 32% rise in London counterterrorism arrests over the last year, and there were 225 people in the last 12 months since August. And this includes females and 17 teenagers. Now, all my stats are in the UK. It's a context that I'm more familiar with. More widely in England and Wales and Scotland, there were record levels of terrorism-related arrests last year, with 338 people held, which was an increase of over 254. So there was only about 100 the previous year, but now there's over 300. More than half of these arrests are related to Syria. And as you can see also, more and more of these arrests are for people who are under the age of 20. Now, I think that there are two ways of looking at this issue. The first is to suggest that terrorism is getting worse. And while Syria presents a unique case, and that's where a lot of the inflation is occurring, there's another way of looking at this, and I'm certainly not denying that one way. In fact, it's both and. But the second way is to look at the problem by looking at systemic reasons that the number of people convicted of terrorist offenses has increased. And I think that there are three systemic reasons. The first is that there have been expanded definitions of terrorism under revised counterterrorism legislation, and this is across Western nations. Second are changing policing and sentencing practices. And third is a general move towards punitiveness. So turning to the first of these, terrorism is so horrific that it justifies extraordinary measures to prevent it from happening. So Condoleezza Rice, when she was arguing for the existence of Guantanamo Bay, said that we have never fought a war like this. You can't allow someone to commit a crime before you detain them, because if they commit that crime, thousands of innocent people will die. So this type of thinking has contributed to increased counterterrorism measures, including broadened counterterrorism legislation that has granted authorities power to prevent terrorism before it occurs. Now, these authors, McCulloch and Pickering, argue that there has been a major shift towards something called pre-crime, such as evident in criminalizing preparatory acts of terrorism. And this includes those offenses that do not require any specific identified acts to be planned or attempted. The authors argue that this enters the domain of pre-crime, which you may recognize from science fiction in The Minority Report, which was written by Philip Dick in the 1960s and adapted with Tom Cruise. Now, I'm not a legal expert, but this emphasis towards criminalizing terrorism at what people say are the earlier stages of terrorism has contributed to an increasing numbers of people who can be arrested for terrorism. Now, I do know of prisoners who have served jail sentences. This is an example of the increased counterterrorism legislation from the UK. I don't think I could give such a succinct list for the most recent Bill C-51, but this will do. But just to let you know, I do know of prisoners who have served jail sentences for having extremist material. And if you want to know, I will tell you what not to download, just in case. And I also know of a prisoner who was in prison for having given a SIM card, a cell phone card, and a very negligible sum of money to a friend to help him travel for purported terrorist training. So this is very much a reality. It's a small reality. It doesn't necessarily affect you and I, but it is a reality. Now, a second reason why there are more people facing terrorist charges is that there are changes in policing and sentencing practices. This increased scope of policing is evident in the attention to preventing terrorism through community cohesion projects. Within this mandate of preventing terrorism at earlier points, community cohesion projects, such as cultural activities, youth clubs, citizenship, training, and even interreligious dialogue, have become securitized. And that means that these activities are the means through which counterterrorism policing practices, including intelligence gathering, are exercised. And this was a repeating critique of the UK's PREVENT strategy, which has undergone several iterations, but it still has this issue that it's working through. And the effect, what scholars say, is that they are creating suspect communities, because this work is conflating counterterrorism with building communities up in very positive ways, but it's done through the lens of security, which is very problematic. And I think Canada has begun a very similar practice. And there's also been changes to sentencing practices where the evidence base has shifted. And so Pickering and McCulloch again say that terrorism prosecutions under pre-crime regimes are typically commenced on the basis of vast amounts of circumstantial evidence that has the flavor of intelligence in that it tends to be voluminous, disparate, and unremarkable in isolation, thus requiring juries to join the dots to a meaningful conclusion. Again, this is not my particular area of expertise, but it does make the point that there are systemic reasons that are inflating the numbers of people who can be charged for terrorist-related activities. And finally, there is a widespread attitude of punitiveness towards terrorism. Punitiveness generally is a criminological concept, and it basically means being tough on crime. So you can be tough on crime in a number of ways, having harsher penalties, increasing the intensity of punishment, or increasing the length of punishment. Now, there is a very specific attitude of punitiveness towards convicted terrorists. The attitude is to punish, deter, and incapacitate. And these were the words of Lord Bingham, who was speaking in the context of the Provisional IRA members in the late 1990s. And he was, in fact, speaking in the context of advocating for less excessive sentences. He explained that the objective behind sentencing in serious cases of terrorism differed from those applicable to ordinary criminal trials. Terrorism cases were of such abnormal seriousness that the object of the court will be to punish, deter, and incapacitate. And he continues and he says, rehabilitation is likely to play a minor, if any, part. So rehabilitation is off the menu. This has been an influential attitude in Australian courts, some scholars have observed, and it's definitely evident in returning fighters. Countries are deciding to put people who even decide to leave against this counterterrorism legislation. So Denmark's program, I think, is probably one of the few instances of the countries that buck this trend, and they use prison only as a last resort and only for those who commit serious crimes. So there are other options out here. And I think that we need to question whether charging a 16-year-old boy with terrorism-related offenses is really in the best interest of both the youth and in society more generally. But fast forwarding the picture now to the point that they all come back, there's considerable resistance to the redeemability of the extremist offender that we need to explore. I'll give you some examples from my field research. One prisoner who is convicted of a terrorist-related offense described to me, and he's using the word tact here, which means he was convicted under the 2006 Terrorism Act. And he says, so looking at the assumption that the prison staff have been told to make, that the tact offender will never change and that he will only radicalize people, continues to say, if you're praying with someone, then you're radicalizing someone. If you look at those assumptions that you'll never change, then other people will become contaminated. And I said to him, so you're a virus? And he says, yeah, basically you're a virus. So there's no way to rehabilitate him from the perspective of the prison officers that he was speaking about. One counterterrorism officer said, and this is just an illustration of the attitudes that are out there, he says, yeah, I think most of them have got terrorist all the way through them. So once you've bitten that, I think it's hard to take that out. And has this idea of if you're willing to blow yourself up for the cause, then it's very hard to undo that. And so terrorists are beyond rehabilitation. I'm sorry, it's a bit grim. Now, a judge pronounced that one prisoner convicted of terrorist-related offenses had no real prospect of rehabilitation. And I was also recently at a conference that was looking at what a rehabilitative culture might look like in prisons. And someone had a draft title saying, Rehabilitative Culture with Extremist Populations. Really? So it was a bit ironic because I think the presenter was wanting to say, well, yes, there is hope. But it buys into this attitude that actually there's huge amounts of skepticism around it. And this is just a snapshot. Now, it is worth asking whether convicted terrorists present a special case of people who are considered beyond redemption. So, my question here is the view, once a criminal, always a criminal, so just generally for criminals, different from the view, once a terrorist, always a terrorist? This has been a huge topic among criminologists who've had a long-standing interest in studying public attitudes towards crime. And recent work by authors named Maruna and King in this area has included an exploration into how people's belief in redeemability impacts punitive attitudes. Their research was quantitative, but you'll notice that I used their idea of belief in redeemability in the title of my research. So there is, of this paper, so there is research on this. But I want to argue that the case of terrorism reflects a very special form of stigma, special in terms of negative, unique, that's distinct from other types of criminality, and it requires a departure from what criminologists have usually examined. And I think this requires an exploration into some pervasive ideas in Western societies about the nation, about belonging, about citizenship, and very specific assumptions about religion. These assumptions about religion are informed by the fact that we are embedded in a secular mode of thinking, even if that thinking is broadly Christian. We, for instance, tend to think religion is generally a good thing, but we expect that it is done generally in private. The high visibility of Islam, with public displays of identity and ritual, is uncomfortable for the Western Christian observer. Now, these are assumptions that are ingrained with us as modern thinking subjects. And what I mean by modern thinking subjects is not modern as opposed to archaic, but modern in the sense that we are a product of our times, and those times are post-Enlightenment thinking, and that limits our gaze. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. And all of this informs our attitudes towards the convicted terrorist. And it's these issues that I'm going to be exploring. And just to recap my 3 points, I'm going to look at 3 ideas. The first is the issue, we have resistance against this idea of the redeemable convicted terrorist because the issue is framed in terms of war. The second, religion is viewed as especially dangerous. And the third is that we don't have any success stories. So I will look at those in turn. In his characteristic style, Ezra Levant described Omar Khadr as the enemy within. I'm sure you've heard of this author. His phrase couldn't have been more accurate, but not for the reasons that I think he intended. The enemy within reflects a pervasive idea that terrorism and counterterrorism is about war. The language of war justifies extraordinary measures and creates stark divisions between friend and enemy. However, the broadening of counterterrorism legislation warrants us to question the suitability of the metaphor of war. Think here about that 16-year-old boy in Quebec. With this language comes national allegiances and new forms of social exclusion that I suggest are unparalleled in other types of criminal offenses. And what I want to suggest is that the category, the word of terrorist, performs a certain function in society. It performs certain work. Namely, it allows us to define the enemy and define the friend. And these distinctions feed into the myth of the unredeemability of the convicted terrorist. I came across Augustine Park from Carleton University and a recent article that he wrote on Omar Khadr. And he describes Omar Khadr's case as having broad social and political significance in that it represents the fierce debate over citizenship and belonging in Canada. Park was interested in how the Canadian public represented Omar Khadr in Canada's 2 national newspapers, so in the Globe and Mail and the National Post. And his work raises important questions around who is allowed to be a Canadian, the limits of being a Canadian, and the subtle ways in which Khadr and others in Canadian society are marginalized, excluded, and cast out as other. Now, from the public commentary, from his analysis of this public commentary, he finds 2 dominant positions in response to Khadr's repatriation. So this was before his release, but he finds 2 dominant perspectives in response to Khadr's repatriation, so his movement from Guantanamo Bay back to Canada. And the first is a liberal view, and this view is principally concerned with protecting Western values, civilization, and identity. Under this view, it was important for Canada to have Omar Khadr, the last Western prisoner in Guantanamo, repatriated because failure to do so threatened our civility and identity as Westerners. We, as enlightened, progressive people who are concerned with human rights, ought to uphold these values in the face of the terrorists who threaten them. Yet, Canada's passive acceptance of Guantanamo Bay and the political toothlessness against the United States sent a different message of the values that Canada upheld in international politics. Now, Park's argument, and I may be overstating it a bit in my zealousness, is that the liberal conscience sought repatriation for Khadr so as to preserve our values over the seemingly backward and violent non-Western other. So the act of repatriation served to redeem the liberal conscience, while upholding the distinction that we are better than them. And this has implications because while asserting that Khadr's legal citizenship entitles him to the same treatment as other Canadians, Khadr is simultaneously and pervasively marked as other. So even the liberal discourse, which suggested we bring Khadr home, actually is insisting on his being fundamentally different than us. And so in other words, it's good to have him here because I feel really bad for what happened, but we don't really want you here, but we feel bad. So that's the short of that argument. On the other hand, the racial nationalist view denounces Khadr as un-Canadian, one who is entitled to the rights of Canadian citizenship, yet undeserved of them because of questionable loyalties. This perspective relies on an idea of the nation, where the nation is a biocultural kin group, where immigrants are perpetual outsiders. And it's an extension of what Park calls, and I think this is very catchy, the citizen of convenience, So citizens of convenience are those immigrants who benefit from living in Western society. They have free access to healthcare, education, religious pluralism, and they have religious tolerance around them. But they are within this while engaging in treachery. This serves to define the Western self as open, tolerant, and generous, and under siege, in contrast to the alien who is conniving and disloyal. Now, the phrase used by one author named Razak is that there is a racial structure to citizenship. And what this means is, what this implies, is that such individuals can treat, this is the most extreme form, that some individuals can treat Canada as a hotel and as a jumping off point for the global crusade and jihad. Mixed metaphor there. Canadian identity is constructed through exclusion, and belonging is very narrowly construed in this perspective. And such a racial nationalist view very much argued against the repatriation of Omar Khadr because he was fundamentally un-Canadian. And I think that this is haunting criticism against the myth of Canada as an inclusive, multicultural, and welcoming community. And in case we think that we're immune to these views, I don't know if you can read that. Nonetheless, it says, what does it say? Is Sharia law here? It's a view of xenophobia, and this is a form of graffiti artwork that you can find just over there in the social science building. Sorry, it's a bit crude, but Park's argument suggests that both the liberal and conservative opinions serve in very different ways to marginalize Khadr and to prevent him from entering into full citizenship. And that's his point. But I think we need to go a step further than Park. Because the issue of security is here. So security makes the issue vastly more complex. So it's not merely about, in my case, the instances of people who are convicted of terrorist offenders being un-Canadian, but actually they're perceived as the enemy. And this adds this layer of complexity. And to understand this construction of the enemy, we need to pay close attention to the subtle difference between national security and criminal justice. This is not a distinction that I have thought too much about until recently, but McCulloch and Pickering make this very important distinction for our purposes. They observe that the framework of national security is the domain within which war has traditionally operated. Criminal justice, on the other hand, has the dual goals of controlling crime and upholding justice, which includes equality, fairness, and protection of individual rights. And so what they say is that criminal justice notions of due process promise equal justice. The image of blind justice, long associated with the operation of the courts, symbolizes law operating at the level that is beyond the reach of politics. But then they say that national security, by contrast, is intensely and openly partial. It's very much subject to mood swings. It's directly managed and controlled by government and understood and executed through distinctions between friend and foe, ally and enemy. So I think with this framework in mind, it's very natural to imagine the eventual release and rehabilitation of offenders through the criminal justice system. Those who have committed crimes in society, whatever they may be, like it or not, will eventually be released for the most part. However, these common notions of responsibility have become problematic when thinking about the specific case of people sentenced for terrorist-related offenses, because these individuals are set within the framework of national security. And to drive this point home, their point is made clear in the resistance to Omar Khadr's repatriation in 2011. In this instance, these frameworks suggested two competing responses. So on the one hand, Mr. Khadr had his rights protected under Canadian laws and judicial processes, but in the other view, Mr. Khadr was a national security risk, and the interests of the safety of the nation, not to mention the alliances with the US, were at stake. So there's two very different objectives that are in a tussle here. Now, within this blurring of boundaries between national security and criminal justice was a failure to see Omar Khadr as Canada's responsibility. It was only when he was repatriated and taken under the care of the province of Alberta that the idea of responsibility, and with it rehabilitation, was in view. So as soon as he gets here, things fundamentally changed. And that's that rupture that I introduced this talk with. Now I rest my point with this image that I think captures the idea that terrorism and counterterrorism is framed in terms of national loyalties. So this was a campaign that was trying to discourage people from going to Syria. And here, the hijab with the Union Jack, this is the English context, is a statement intended to allow people to embrace the compatibility of being Muslim and being British. However, it instead evokes a national allegiance, and it creates a stark boundary between us and them, because it puts Muslim women in a position of stating their national loyalties. And so it's about the nation, isn't it? It's about nations conflicting. And it's a very powerful statement, but I think the effect is actually not helpful, because it's allowing us to think about this in terms of a war of us versus them. And I think as long as we think about this issue in terms of war, in terms of a clash of civilizations, in terms of national allegiances, we are reproducing stark boundaries between us and them, and the idea of the redeemable terrorist is an impossible one. And I think it's through the lens of criminal justice and responsibility that rehabilitation, participation in citizenship, and belonging becomes possible again. There's one more slightly heavy bit, and then we'll get to the more concrete examples. My second point is that there is resistance against the redeemability of the convicted terrorist because we tend to look at religion as especially dangerous. Now, this book by William Kavanagh, called The Myth of Religious Violence, argues that the view of the danger of religion is deeply embedded in Western consciousness. And by myth, he means that there is a set of unquestioned assumptions or taken for granted cultural assumptions that we just live with and we don't really notice. Now, his argument is incredibly persuasive and lengthy and challenging, but I think it's key to understanding why we're so averse to this idea of redeeming the convicted terrorist and why it's beyond the public imagination. Kavanagh argues that our view of religion has a dangerous tendency to promote violence. Kavanagh argues that our view of religion that has a dangerous tendency to promote violence is an idea that has its roots in the modern nation state and in Enlightenment thinking. So this goes back to 17th, 18th century, is this argument that the founding of the nation state has allowed us to think, because of political theorists in Europe who framed the French Reformation Wars and the 30 Years' Wars in terms of theological disputes. What we have is this idea that religion is violent, but actually the state is just fine. State is rational, religion is irrational. And he argues that the founding of the modern nation state marked a turn away from the irrationality of religion towards a rational and this worldly place. Kavanagh argues that this turn came to fully inscribe the myth of religious violence that is carried up to today. And this myth suggests that state exercise power and violence is rational and justified, so think here of drone strikes, while religious violence is absolutist, divisive, and irrational. Now a concrete example. I see you're happy about that. To illustrate the view that religion is dangerous because it is fundamentally irrational in nature, I want to show you a dialogue that arose during a trial of two Muslim prisoners who attacked another prisoner for purportedly offending the religion of Islam. One of the attackers was convicted for a terrorist-related offense, and the victim suffered only minor cuts and scrapes from the incident. The attackers received, between the two of them, an additional 16 years onto their sentence. This was one of two incidents during our field work, violent incidents during our field work. The second involved a slashing of a prisoner with a broken plate over a purported drug debt that drew a man to within inches of his life. As far as I'm aware, that attack did not go to trial. Now, I will simply read this dialogue, but I want you to look out for how the argument from the prosecuting lawyer is developed, first by establishing that these prisoners were devout Muslims, and second, that as devout Muslims, their actions would be guided by an irrational, fervent passion. You'll notice that this is all that the prosecutor needs to establish, because what he can do is he can appeal to the myth of religious violence that he knows the jury will buy into. And you'll see as well, the prisoner is pushing back. He's saying, no, it's not like this. And you'll see this as I read through this. So this is from a transcript. The prosecuting lawyer says, "Would you regard yourself as a devout Muslim, Mr. Hamid?" And Mr. Hamid replies, but he rephrases it. He says, "Practicing, yes." And the lawyer responds, "Isn't the reality of the situation, Mr. Hamid, that the rumor we began this case with, the rumor of the insult to the Prophet, was something that angered you and burned within you for a long time?" So there's that irrational passion. And Mr. Hamid says, "No, I will explain." And the lawyer says, "Just answer the question." Sounds very much like a courtroom drama. And Hamid explains. He says, "I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm trying to give my defense." And he says, "I've heard all of these racial slurs throughout my life." And he says, "I've had no reaction to them. I'm desensitized to them." And he picks up on what the lawyer is saying, and he says, "You're trying to say that I've got fanatical, radicalized views. I grew up in this country. My religion is a religion of peace and patience." And the lawyer replies, "Eloquently put, Mr. Hamid. I'm sure the jury will decide." And he continues to press his point. "I'm suggesting this rumor angered you considerably and your friend." And Mr. Hamid pushes back and says, "No, but that was all that is required because the jury has this myth." Kavanagh's work makes one important other point. He observes that the more that people are marginalized as other, the more other they become. For my purposes, we can understand that in terms of the more other they become, the less opportunity there is for their redemption or rehabilitation. And I'm going to give you another quote from a prisoner who was not convicted of terrorist-related offenses, but it illustrates his point that the more other you make them, the more other they will become. And so he does give a bit of a complex background into his story here, but he says that he was out of prison, he had a sentence for robbery with firearms, and he went to see his probation officer. Now his probation officer ends up asking him, "What are your views on suicide bombing and the world's current affairs?" And so just to be sarcastic and cheeky, and he says, "Because I was pissed off by that, I said, yeah, I can round up 100 soldiers and they will do damage. I'm with all the suicide bombers, yada, yada, yada." So he's playing tough and being sarcastic. And he says that what happened is that she got in touch with the anti-terrorism team, and he got recalled back into prison for 4 months. And he keeps on insisting that, there's a context for this. She riled me up, etc. And he says, "All I have been drumming on about is that I need employment. I need help with my CV. I need to stand on my own 2 feet. But I wasn't getting no help. All I was being told was that you are not there to help me. You are just there to monitor me and make sure that I'm not involved in any criminality." And he continues. He says, basically, he got out of prison. Again, he got back into prison, unfortunately. Now, when he's in prison, this gets brought up every year. And so it gets brought up that he holds anti-Semitic views, that he holds certain views about suicide bombers. And then he continues, and he says, "That is when I say that I don't trust the system, because I find the system evil. I find them manipulative, and I find them how can I put it? I find them to be spawns of the devil. That's what they are. Anyone that believes in God, whether they are Christians, whether they are Jewish, whether they are Muslim, the system is made to break them down. Because that's what the devil does. He doesn't like followers. He wants to break followers down. Because he knows that we are all related. Jews, Christians, Muslims, we are all related to the system. They are all devil worshippers. Now, what I worry about is that the more we make the convicted terrorist offender other, the more they will become beyond redemption and the more other they will become. You could observe it, I hope, through that transcript, how they made him other and he pushed back. Now I'm going to turn to a more positive note after that. This is the idea of success stories. We don't have very many success stories because this is a very new issue. Maruna and King, these authors that I like, acknowledge that there is little known about how to change an individual's views about the redeemability of criminals generally, but they suggest that exposure to success stories might help. Success stories, in Goffman's language, may create a rupture in our expectation, leading us to reconsider how we categorize others, as I began with. Now, these quotes are from my broader study from my colleagues in Cambridge, and as I may have mentioned, this study wasn't directly focused on the central question of here today. I'll talk more about that tomorrow, but this information, this data, provides nonetheless a snapshot into the fact that convicted terrorist offenders can be reformed, and it points to some of the features of this reform. Now, I follow a broad movement in rehabilitation research that focuses on what helps rather than what works. And that's a very important distinction because it has very different implications. So what works implies a silver bullet that would somehow take the radical out of people. And I feel that every time that somebody uses the phrase de-radicalization, as though there's some sort of surgical tool that we can, with precision, remove the radical from them. But my approach is decidedly more old school, and as Ward and Maruna have argued persuasively, following Tony Bottoms and others, shifting the question to what helps allows you to begin to focus on promoting what we know helps without expecting it to work with scientific accuracy. So let's build up what we know works, rather than trying to systematize it into a formula. Ward and Maruna furthermore suggested a move away from focusing on risk towards focusing more closely on the good of people, and the good that people can become is far more beneficial. So let's focus on the good in people. When Omar Khadr was released, and he was asked about what he would say to Prime Minister Stephen Harper, who resisted his repatriation, he replied, "I'm going to have to disappoint him. I'm better than the person he thinks I am." And so there's this orientation towards the good, becoming a better person. And it reminds me of a prisoner who's convicted of terrorist-related offenses who quoted Marcus Aurelius verbatim to me. He said that, "Don't live as though you were going to live a myriad year. Fate is hanging over your head. While you have life, while you may, become good." So the idea here is bringing out the good in people. One prisoner described to me how he had moved beyond violence while retaining his sense of identity. So I'm going to give you three descriptions of individuals who I don't have longitudinal data for, saying that they haven't reoffended or anything like this, but I think that there's hope for them. I think that they are on the path towards rehabilitation. But what I want to highlight is that each of their stories is very different, and they do this in a different way. And this prisoner says, I asked him, "Do you feel you can be yourself in here?" He said, "No, not originally." And he said he was very scared of what prison officers would write about him, etc. And I asked him, "How do you become less scared?" And he said, "I think I understand my faith better now. When I first came in, I didn't really care. Once I got found guilty, I thought, oh, you know what? I'm going to show you who I really am. I'm going to show you the terrorist I really am." And there's pushback. And then he continues and he says, "But let me just be who I want to be. Because when you're doing something to please them, it's like you're taking a piece of yourself away, just to please them." Another prisoner found reform by a different means, as his journey made him see Islam as internalized and about character. So he says, and he's very much contrasting his approach with the previous quote. He says that some people wouldn't compromise their identity, whereas I don't feel I'm doing that because I feel I still have my core values, because I feel that most religions just try to build good character. Like good qualities, good virtues, and as long as you're not compromising them, I feel external appearance and ritual observance is just that. It's just ritual observance. But the key is to actually build character. So there is this orientation towards becoming a better person, and how it's done is a bit different, but there's still that orientation. Now, this final example is of a prisoner who was completely disillusioned, having been in prison and seeing prison life and how Islam was expressed within prison. He said that he had renounced violence, but he became disillusioned with Muslim prisoners anyway. And he says, it's not an identity that I want to have. He said, I hate them, so I don't want to have the same identity as them, more of the opposite. And he said, they are the biggest hypocrites I've ever met in the world. I hate hypocrisy. And they've really pulled me away from the faith. Now, one final little nugget from rehabilitation research, which suggests that mentorship and relational bonds and trust are very important to rehabilitation. This prisoner describes this relational bond within prison very well. And believe it or not, this was with a counterterrorism officer. So a member of staff was able to create a bond with this individual. And he says, so the thing for me is if they actually give a damn about me, like she did, then I trust her. If they don't care about me, why am I going to trust them? And he continues, and you can see the dialogue continues, and with how we interview, it's actually, we do laugh, and we had one-on-one interviews, and I suggested, well, we should rephrase the question to be, who gives a damn about you? Because that would really, I think, be very helpful. Who does care about you? So this notion of who cares about you is such a profound one, and it's so simple, but it was so important in this case. And this reminds me of Omar Khadr's story again, and it reminds me that it's not a journey that he took alone. It would have been unimaginable, I think, for him to have done this without the support that he received. So another one of my favorite quotes Dennis Edney said was, "So we journeyed together. We have, in some ways, both grown up together. I'm proud of who he is. He's gone through hell. I'm proud of who he is." This isn't a formula that you can package into de-radicalization programs, and this is the reason why nobody's flying me to Ottawa, because this is the stuff of raw human experiences and relationships. But it's not easy. So to conclude, I began this talk by suggesting that Omar Khadr represents a rupture in our expectation. He was not what we expected. He defied the liberal attempt to assuage its own guilt by exercising his own agency, and he defied the racial nationalist attempt at exclusion. He's here to stay. Deal with it. He has placed the onus of responsibility on us to reconsider just how elastic we can allow our notions of belonging to be, and to reflect on how commonly we exclude others from being fully Canadian and from being fully human. Looking more broadly at the idea of the redeemable extremist puts even more strain on the question of belonging, exclusion, and responsibility. It makes us question our assumptions about who gets labeled as dangerous and who gets labeled as the enemy. It also makes us question new systemic factors in our society today, including broadened counterterrorism legislation, changes in policing and sentencing practices, as well as punitive attitudes towards terrorism offenses. All of this is supposed to make us safer, but we need to radically rethink what security means today. As we learned from the prisoner, who described the safeguarding practices of his probation officer, the one who is very angry, the more you marginalize the other, the more other they become. Similarly, the more that you see people as beyond redemption, the more beyond redemption they will become. Now, as a sociologist, my focus is very much on individual stories, as you can probably tell, and relationships on the ground, as well as informal and non-state processes, which is a bit jargony. But this allows me to rethink the issue in a way that is more grounded and less aloof and less political than you might find in the disciplines such as political science. And I think that it's a helpful approach, and it makes us have some headway when it comes to avoiding the language of clash of civilizations or, heaven forbid, language of the war on terrorism. And I think that this is where the opportunity is to make a palpable impact. I'm sure you've heard the stories of Omar Khadr's homecoming to the Edney's home. There was apparently a barbecue hosted. There were cupcakes brought and flowers as well. And these were all small sentiments of kindness and welcome. And I think that as the boundaries between the local and the global, between the nation and the international are blurred, and as identities and belonging can shift, such acts can have a rippling effect around the world. The fact that Omar Khadr is very international, is now living in an Edmonton suburb, and acts of kindness can actually begin to heal is very profound, I think. And I think that the tradition of peace building helps us to understand the possibility of the redeemed terrorist, and it hints at a compelling vision that breaks down barriers of otherness, that builds and restores trust, and recognizes that a certain amount of self-scrutiny is essential when trying to understand the lives of others who do not necessarily share those commitments. Penultimate slide. Peace building begins by breaking down the myth of the redeemable terrorist and their intrinsic otherness. As Maruna and King say, a person's intrinsic otherness has implications for our understanding. Through intrinsic evil, there can be no mutual intelligibility, no bridge of understanding, no real communication between us and them. So seeing someone as evil breaks down these possibilities and the possibilities of rehabilitation. So I'll conclude with one brief last story. Last December, I was at a practitioner conference in a European country, I'll keep it anonymous, where Professor Alison Liebling was presenting our research to a group of practitioners who work in prisons across Europe. And this presenter described how she was a prison governor and she had a special unit that held terrorist offenders. And I think there was a dozen or so in there. And she was talking about how there was one individual who had become de-radicalized. And of course, you can imagine the audience of governors, people who run prisons, they perked up and they thought, what is this? How did it happen? And so somebody asks, how did it happen? And she took a moment, she was slightly taken aback, and she thought about it for a moment, and she said, well, we gave him books and we treated him kindly. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. I'm sure there were lots of questions for Ryan. Maybe I could prime the pump. So you suggested, Ryan, there are two approaches we can take. One is to view them as criminals who then are in the justice system and have rights and can be redeemed, or to view them as kind of enemies of state. So you would suggest that all people who qualify are arrested for terrorism the potential for their redeemability, it will lie in choosing the paradigm of criminality.
Yes.
That's the choice that we face.
Yes. Can everybody hear me if I just speak like this? Or I can move up. Yes, there are, I think this is where the trend is moving to. And so there, as I understand it, there's been various ways that international terrorists have been dealt with. Guantanamo Bay was one of those. But I'm suggesting that this is an essential part of what basically Western societies are doing to themselves. And so if we're going to incarcerate and charge more and more people under a broader definition, then the only way that we need to deal with them, that's not a good word, but the only way that we can respond to them is by treating them as humans through the criminal justice system. And so I'm trying to say that we need to start to abandon this language of war and this notion that this is about us versus them, because these are our citizens through our legislation. This is our problem. We need to be responsible and face up to it.
We'll use the mic.
Thanks very much, Ryan. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about two terms you used. And it seemed to me that you used them rather interchangeably, but it seems also to me that they're very different: redemption and rehabilitation. So redemption, I did just a really quick Google search. It seems to come from the notion of atonement, or a very theologically freighted sort of term, whereas rehabilitation has a medical sort of background, the ability to kind of make able again, as it were. So now, one is very theological, the other one not so much, although one could argue make able could be, it begs the question, make able to be what or to do what. So I guess I just want you to reflect a little bit on those two words. Are they for you, or in this discourse, interchangeable? Do they have particular connotations that we need to be careful about?
Right, no, very good question, thank you. The way that they are used, from what I understand, so I use redeemability from criminologists who have employed a new measure of belief in rehabilitation. So I think they use them quite interchangeably, so rehabilitation equals redeemability. I think that there is nuance in them that could be unpacked, but I don't think that those specific authors unpack it. And I think you're right to point out that a more clinical view isn't exactly what people potentially convicted of terrorist-related offenses need if it is on the moral purpose level. There may need to be a more spiritual, religious aspect there. And I think that this is where criminology, and I'm in religious studies, and I can observe this in criminology. Criminology is a very Christian-oriented discipline. It grew out of the 18th prisons, grew out of the 17th and 18th centuries, and it was very Christian-led for the purposes of rehabilitation. And I think that what we're entering is a post-Christian era of criminology. And from what I understand, there's not much research that's accounting for the dominance of Islam, and there's not much research that's accounting for secularity, secularism. So there are those two biases going on. Thank you.
Okay. Another question?
Yeah, the question I want to ask is, should members of one religion be rehabilitating a member of another religion?
You bring up a very tangled question. So the question was, should one member of one religion rehabilitate the member of another religion? So what's surprising in a secular country like Britain and like Canada is that they do use, and I know the English context a lot better, they do use imams as part of rehabilitation for Muslim prisoners. And so religious rehabilitation generally is performed. So I'm trying to unpack another set of opposition. So should religious rehabilitation be something that a secular state employs at all? And I'll get to your other point in a second, because there's also psychologists who employ things, employ certain measures, and there's lots of controversy around, what role should the state play in religion? And usually it's done between members of the same faith. But your question now is, should it be done by members of different religious traditions? So should a Christian rehabilitate a Muslim and vice versa? It might be more problematic from a state administration perspective to formally implement the policy of Christian chaplains rehabilitating Muslims, because they would prefer to have someone from their own religious tradition. But I think that doesn't preclude the idea that people of other faiths can have profound impacts on other people's lives. So in an informal sense, I have no moral opposition to people helping other people out, even if they are of different religious denominations. But I think that from the state perspective, the state would get in trouble if they had Christian chaplains de-radicalizing, I don't like that word, rehabilitating convicted terrorists, for instance. Does that answer your question? Okay. Right. Yes. Yes, yes, absolutely. You should come from within the tradition, yes. And I met some exceptional prison imams. They were just doing fantastic work. And what they suggested is that even though they recognized that their job was quite broad, part of it was rehabilitation for extremist offenders. And what they recognized was that it wasn't all about theology. They said, all that I can do is I can work on their theology, that's it. But I can't help with marginalization. I can't help with systemic discrimination. I can't help with all of these others. I can't help with poverty, all of these things. I just work on the theology. And so there's a whole nexus of things that need to be involved in order for people to be rehabilitated. Thank you.
Most of what we've been talking is somehow religion oriented. And yet it seems to me this is part of a much broader picture of ideological extremism. Has anyone looked at the Red Guard in China? They faded away. What happened? They were terrorists. They were not criminalized, and now they're gone. Communists, other kinds, fascists, Nazis, it's the same thing, isn't it? And there's no religion involved in any of them, except to the extent their religion is ideological itself. What can we learn about that? They've all faded away. I think they grew out of it.
Yes, I think you point on Kavanagh's observation about the myth of religious violence, that somehow religious violence is all the worst, but some of the secular national forms of violence that you were pointing out are just as bad in a lot of ways, aren't they? So there certainly has been research on that. There is huge debate around this. There are people who say that everything is all the same, it's all terrorism or whatnot, it's all the means to the end. But I think that it intersects with a unique nexus of issues. So the sets of issues that I was trying to bring up is that even though this extremism might seem similar to the IRA or something like this, it intersects in different ways because we have the other is constructed differently. Islam is involved. There's different content. The form might be similar, but I think there's different content. And if we sort of steamroller all the differences, then we miss the attention to those details, which are actually very important to understanding the problem.
Okay.
Well, I probably could do it without the mic. Ryan, one of the things that caught me about what you're saying is, and it may not be a good time for doing this, given the fact that we've undertaken a very draconian-looking route towards our criminal justice system at the moment. That at one point, when rehabilitation was more the dialogue within the prison system, there was the sense that part of what was going on was to look at the underlying social issues that led to crime, etc. And what I sometimes hear you suggesting here is that if we could get out of the war rhetoric and transfer it back into the criminal justice system and begin to use that framework of rehabilitation, there's a possibility possibility, as this gentleman was saying, of stepping back and seeing what are the underlying causes. Because at the moment we're not dealing with it, but as you just said, or hinted at, some of these underlying causes that are leading young people in Britain and other places to go towards some of these groups are very similar to what we've seen before in gangs and other things. It is poverty, it is lack of opportunity, it's no place to go, and that sort of thing. But all of that seems to be forgotten about because
Yes.
we can use the rhetoric of war and then we don't have to deal with it.
Yes, no, absolutely. It's easier to say that it's someone else causing the problem than actually to admit that our society needs a bit of help in some areas. So I agree entirely. Thank you.
I look at the title of your paper, and you have noticeably put unredeemable in quote marks, so I presume you sweated buckets to know whether or not that's appropriate word to use, and I don't think it is. I think the word unredeemable must mean something theologically only. Maybe redeeming doesn't have that, but the negative, the unredeemable, is something only a theological type thinker would come up with, not somebody in the legal, conversation. I maybe that's not a question, but it does seem to me to be a problem.
No, I do certainly think that word choice is important. As I mentioned, this term was derived from some criminologists who look at this construct of the belief in redeemability. And I thought it was catchy, to be honest. But I agree with this point that it's something that makes more sense in the theological world. Unreformable, yeah, there's probably different words that you could use, but I thought it was catchy. But thank you.
Maybe I'll ask another question, Ryan. Am I right that you feel that you're swimming against the stream, that the consensus in the criminal justice system itself seems to be that these people are not to be rehabilitated? Is that the overwhelming sense? Are you having to deal with that overwhelming attitude?
I think that there is some belief there. I mean, I've also been working very closely with police, people in prison who work with this type of offender. And actually, there is more hope than perhaps I have put forward. I don't think that this is the only view that people have. I don't think that everybody thinks that convicted terrorists are unredeemable. But what I was trying to do today is to unpack the reasons why there is so much resistance to it. And I think that I did see that in prisons, but you don't see that everywhere. I've seen people do fantastic work in prisons and among the police as well. So it can be done, and those attitudes aren't there. But there is this layer of skepticism, and we need to begin to whittle away at that layer of skepticism because it's disallowing us to see the problem with clarity. So I hope that through this I've been able to get rid of some of that dross and potentially see the problem a bit more clearly, if that's possible.
Okay, there is another question. Maybe we'll make this the last.
How are you?
Hi. I'm just wondering, every time we talk about rehabilitating someone in the normal criminal justice system, when we think of criminals who commit crimes, they seem to know they're committing a crime, and then there's sort of a guilt factor, and there's a whole bunch of other things that motivate them they have to overcome to commit that crime. But when you get ideological and some of these beliefs that a terrorist would adopt to do what he's doing, there's no guilt. It's like, I'm doing the right thing. So to fight that in a Western society, I mean, I'm sure there's some places in the world that this conversation would be a lot different, depending on the part of the belief system of that place in the world. And I know too that extreme violent behavior is not the norm in Islam. It's just that it's actually a rare exception. So how do we address that when we deal with these people who are supposedly criminals in our society, but they all believe that they're doing the right thing and there's no conscience against it?
Yes, excellent point. So just to summarize, you were suggesting that in normal criminality, it's pretty clear you can't rob banks, you can't abuse people physically, these sorts of things. But when it comes to the case of people committing terrorist offenses, there's this idea that actually what they're doing is right and it's a part of who they are. I think you're entirely right to hone in to the fact that it is a completely different phenomenon and we need to consider that. Now let me think about my answer. It is a challenge. What I was trying to illustrate with those three cases was that they can see that violence was wrong, that their means of changing society was wrong through violence. And I think we need to continue to focus on this point that it's about violence. It's not about what you're reading, assuming that that will then lead to violence. It's about the actual act of violence. And so these individuals, as I tried to describe, at least the first two, or at least the first individual, I think he's the best case, he still had this deep sense of who he was as a Muslim, that, yeah, maybe his method wasn't right, but he still has all the beliefs. And he still, I think, believes in certain visions of society. He has certain visions of what good, proper behavior is. But I'm hoping that I'm right in assuming that he thinks the method is wrong. And so we need the method of violence, that is. And so that, I think, is easier than trying to use a scalpel and take out, well, you need to look like me, in the sense of being more secular or liberal, something like that. Does that address that a bit?
I'm wondering though if the exposure to all the people who are actually convicted terrorists in prisons who we looked at, if you look at the vast majority of Muslims around the world, they are peaceful.
Yes.
And these are, I would almost call it like a cult
Hmm.
in Islam. I hate to say that, I don't want to offend anyone, but it's like the extreme good Christian beliefs. We get the French Davidians who would break off from a Christian group and become absolutely violent and anti-society.
Hmm.
A lot of different people have these break-off splinter groups, usually extreme minority. And I'm wondering if, I hate to say it, I like the term, but it's almost like a cult. Most Muslims I've met would denounce them as even being Muslim. It's like, these guys can't be Muslims for the way they behave.
Hmm.
They're too violent, they're murderers,
Hmm.
criminals. And it's so contradictory to what they're taught as faith.
Hmm. Yeah, I think just to go back to the point that it's about violence, that's what we should be worried about. Because as soon as you start to go backwards, you begin to wonder, well, is it this belief that's doing this? Is it this belief that does that? And I know with new policing strategies, that becomes a bit more challenging because you need to prevent terrible things from happening. But we don't want to lose sight of the fact that the problem isn't radical beliefs. I once held radical beliefs, I'm certain of it. But it's about violence. And I think that sort of sharpens things a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan, for a stimulating talk. Let's express our appreciation. It's been a great conversation. I'm sure Ryan would be happy to chat with you further. Thanks for coming.